Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast. Hunter's with me, and Hunter and I are continuing our best reads of the year today.
That's right. In fact, this episode was so long that we decided we better break it down into two episodes just for digestibility sake. You mentioned on a previous podcast that we're not trying to compete with Joe Rogan, but we almost did with our epically long 2024 Reads podcast.
Yeah, we got into it and said, wow, this is fixing to be a 2-hour podcast. That doesn't seem like a good call. So we are back with part 2 of our best reads of 2024, and we're going to just pick up where we left off. We had one more book to mention in the biography and history category, and this book, I think it took up a lot of your reading time this past year, Hunter.
It took up a lot of space in my reading life, and I kind of picked away at it slowly but surely. It's called The Last Lion. It's a biography of Winston Churchill, and this is volume 2. It covers the period 1932 to 1940. And Autumn, what was happening in those 8 years?
What was happening in 1932 to 1940?
I'm testing your knowledge of history, yes.
Oh, well, I think that you've been reading all about it. So it seems to me that you should be the one to inform us on what was happening in 1932 to 1940.
Well, that was the build-up to World War II, and it was the rise of Nazi Germany and their hegemony spreading throughout Europe. Hegemony is a great word. It is spelled Hegemony. It means like using force and power to dominate your neighbors. And Germany was this hegemonic power that was rising. And as it's rising, a lot of Europe is still fatigued from World War I, and a lot of the British leadership class was still fatigued from World War I, and so they're trying to appease Hitler. There's this theory of appeasement. We can appease Adolf Hitler, and Churchill is probably the most prominent person in England anyway, maybe not the first, but the most prominent person in England who sees very clearly that Hitler is not going to be appeased. He actually really understands the guy really, really well, which is a fascinating lesson of history, to understand your opponent or to understand other people. And Churchill sees him for what he is, and he begins to warn his countrymen, and nobody listens to him.
You wrote an interesting note in your description, which I can see as we're having this discussion. And you said the second volume of Manchester's lyrical biography. What did you mean by that little note?
William Manchester, the author, is a fantastic storyteller and a fantastic writer. And so just the way the writing sits is just great to read. It's just poetic, or has a great literary quality to it. He also does a great job of describing the world surrounding Churchill, and he continually kind of takes like detours out into the wider social world, and will describe kind of the situation in which he sits. I've recently been audiobooking another biography of Lyndon Johnson by Robert Caro, which is like 4 volumes long. And I'm doing it mostly as an audiobook, but Robert Caro, at least in the first volume I'm in, does the same thing. He describes the social context and the world in which LBJ lived, and sometimes he'll devote whole chapters to a secondary character in the story, but it's essential to understanding this character's biography to understand how he interfaced with LBJ, and so you get kind of this world that he builds out for you. And William Manchester does the same thing with early 20th century England in both his first and his second volumes of this Winston Churchill biography. So this biography ends at the beginning or the early days of World War II, when Churchill becomes prime minister, and now he has to lead England off the mat to respond to this cancer that has spread across Europe. France by now has fallen. And so as he's describing the buildup to Churchill becoming prime minister, he's describing all the political machinations of England and what's going on inside England at the time. And so you get this fascinating picture of how people and personalities are playing off of each other and relating to each other, and there's this conflict of ideas. So all of it's fascinating for that reason. And of course, Churchill himself is just a luminous character. He's this bright, shining light of a man. In fact, he got so frustrated with the ruling class. He is in this buildup. He's a member of the House of Commons, but he's not what they would call in the government. I mean, he doesn't have a cabinet post, and so he's just a backbencher. He's part of the Conservative Party, which is in power, but he's not being given any real leadership or any real responsibility or access to the direction of the Conservative Party. And so Churchill has a country manor at Chartwell outside of London, and he just sets up shop at Chartwell and builds his own intelligence gathering system at Chartwell. He develops contacts inside Nazi Germany as well as inside all the other European governments, and he figures out what's going on based on just his own cultivated intelligence sources. So by the time he becomes prime minister, he maybe understands better than the man Neville Chamberlain, who actually was the prime minister. He maybe understands better than Neville Chamberlain what's actually happening, on the ground in the British military and also inside the German military, because he's developed all these intelligence sources.
This book is The Last Line, Volume 2, Winston Spencer Churchill, and covers the years 1932 to 1940. How many volumes in total are in this set?
There's one more volume, so there's 3 volumes total in this set. And the author died before he finished writing the 3rd volume, which you're not surprised when you read the first 2 and see how long they are. And someone else gathered his notes and finished this 3rd volume. And I'm told that the 3rd volume is not interesting of a read. Like, it's not written in the same style as the first 2. And so a lot of people who read these volumes will only read the first 2 because they're the only 2 that were written by William Manchester himself. So we'll see if I read volume 3. It is also the longest one of them, but it also covers World War II, which is obviously significant.
All right. Well, we'll see. We'll return to that question later as to whether or not you read Volume 3 or begin it and abandon it. That is the final book that we have listed in our biography and history category for 2024. And then next, we just sort of have a bit of a catch-all category that we call general interest.
Anything that won't fit in any other category?
Exactly. Yes. So books that don't fit neatly in one of our other categories. And the first book that we wanted to mention in this category is called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. This is a book that I read this last year. It also has been covered widely in the media. Jonathan Haidt is a well-known author and professor. And so this might be a book that has some name recognition among our listeners.
I recognize it, and it's been on my reading list, but I have not read it, so I'm eager to hear your summary for me.
Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist and a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's authored many other books. This book in particular is asking what caused or what are the causal factors for what is now being called an epidemic of mental illness among teenagers. He's asking it about teens in the United States, although the trend holds true for teenagers in Europe, in Western Europe, particularly in Australia. And so he points out that some of these data points fit, some of the data points that he rests his argument on fit not only for the United States, but also for some of these other large swaths of the country. And he's come to the conclusion that one of the causal factors for what's being called an epidemic of mental illness among teenagers is social media. So he talks about the use of individual digital devices like smartphones or tablets, the very prevalent use of social media among teenagers from age. He looks at data points for teens really from age 12 to 18 or into young adulthood. But it's pretty commonplace for kids as young as 10 or 11 to have their own device. So he attributes, not fully, But this spike in rates of anxiety and depression and suicidality among teenagers to social media and the access, the sort of unending access that kids in that age range have via individual digital devices to social media. And then he talks about not only that factor, and definitely because he is a researcher, so much of this book includes a lot of data. So it has a lot of graphs and charts, and he is approaching this like a researcher. And because he wants to state definitively that his research is showing that there is a causal link, not just a correlation, which is different in the world of research, but a causal link between social media use and teen mental illness rates. So he wants to definitely rest his case on this data that some of it is data that he himself has overseen the research for. And then he also cites other research statistics to create his case. So he examines that, and he examines the way that societally we have shifted into a model that doesn't encourage kids in the world of independent play nearly as much as it used to. And so he talks about how that has impacted mental health in children, but also their just ability to function well in the world. And he examines that cause as well. And then he gives some very practical suggestions towards the end of the book for parents, for schools, and for government. And so it was a very good. I wouldn't say this was a titillating read.
Well, you said charts and graphs, and I kind of glazed over. I appreciate data, and I also don't want to read books that have a lot of data in them or charts and graphs. I just skip those in all the books I read.
I think because of the purpose of the book, he's hoping to actually encourage people to action through it. And so he wants to definitely make sure that what he's stating is verifiable.
Sure.
And one of the things I appreciated most about it was that he points out that where we are now in terms of these questions that he's asking in the book is that we have a collective action problem. And that means, for instance, many kids have an individual digital device because most of their peers do. And so parents experience, by way of their children, their kids saying, but everyone else has X. Everyone else has Snapchat. Everyone else has Instagram. Everyone else has a smartphone. And then you get the sense as a parent that your child will be left out of their peer group or somewhat distanced from their peer group if they don't also have access to those same things. And then in schools, he points out how this collective action problem develops. And so he's hoping to actually encourage action, collective action, to respond to what he sees as a collective action problem. And so he talks about when whole communities adopt different practices. So if a whole group of parents adopts different practices for their kids, for instance, if a whole group of parents decides that their students will not get a smartphone until they are 14 or 15, or if a whole group of parents decides that their children won't have access to social media until they are 16, then that problem, my child will be left out, is suddenly addressed. Suddenly your child knows someone else or has more friends whose parents are also taking the same path. And so their sense of what is fair or their sense of connectedness to their peers is suddenly, they don't feel that burden in quite the same way. For schools, he suggests, for instance, that entire schools adopt a no cell phone or no individual device policy for the entirety of the school day. So from the beginning of the school day to the end of the school day, no phones or smartwatches or tablets by which kids could access the internet or social media should be allowed. And then that addresses the collective action problem. And some of the suggestions that he gives, the very practical suggestions, I thought were really powerful. And I appreciated those and hope, as Jonathan Haidt is saying, that we actually do see a shift in that direction, the direction that he's advocating for.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm feeling guilty for buying my nephew a Xbox backup battery. That's what he wanted for Christmas. So I'm just feeding the problem here. I'm part of the social contagion So apologies for that, and I will resolve to better actions.
He addresses, I guess what Jonathan Haidt would say is that he addresses the use of gaming systems, particularly for young men, for boys who are teenagers, in a bit different category. He says it can encourage addiction in some cases, but that it doesn't quite, he doesn't cite it as a causal factor to the problems, the rise in mental illness rates. So, maybe not best, but also not quite the issue he's addressing in this.
It's not like I gave him a smartphone.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, you have one more on the general interest list, and I joked in our last episode that this is where we get to hear all your books about farming, but this is actually the only farming book on the list this year, so I'm a little bit disappointed, although some of the other titles to come, just to give our listeners a heads up, do have agrarian overtones to them. Like there's one on here called My Family and Other Animals, which sounds like someone who lives on a farm, so I could be assuming things based on titles, but here it is. This is Autumn's Farm Book of the Year, and it's called Farmer's Glory by A.G. Street. Tell us about this one.
Yes. Arthur George Street, who lived from 1892 to 1966 and published this book, I think, in 1932. He wrote under the name of A.G. Street. He was an English farmer, writer, and broadcaster, and he wrote a couple of books, but Farmer's Glory was his best-known book. And it describes his life on a farm in Wiltshire in the United Kingdom. And then also he spent a few years in Western Canada when he was a young man working on a farm there. Also, I would like to note, Hunter, you are making some assumptions. I do love reading farm books, but You mentioned another book that we'll talk about in a moment, and it does have some agrarian overtones, but it is not a farming book. So this is the only
You're right. I am making assumptions based on what I know about you. So
yes.
And the fact that you and your husband met on farmersonly.com, and the fact that you read the Farmer's Almanac every year. I just, based on these things, I thought.
Okay, one of those two
Autumn
things
really likes the farm books.
One of those two things is not true. Our listeners can determine which it is. I may, probably not every year, but I may on occasion read the Farmer's Almanac and read some farming blogs. That much.
Now the truth is coming out.
Is true. Yes. So unapologetically, I'll tell you a little bit more about Farmer's Glory. But A.G. Street, the value in this book is that he's writing from an autobiographical perspective, but he captures this moment in time when the farming community in England was going through some massive transitions post World War I, in the lead up to World War II, and the whole economic structure in England was shifting, and farmers felt that in a very particular way. And so he recalls growing up on a farm in the United Kingdom. His father was well known in the area, well respected as a farmer in the area. And so he describes the way that land ownership was handled at the time, how many farmers were what was called tenant farmers, but then they oversaw many other people, and the whole economic structure of an area that was connected to farming enterprise. And so he relates growing up on the farm, what he learned, and how really this was part of like the most thoroughgoing part of his education as he saw it. It was just learning about life through watching his father run a farm and through interacting with all of the different people who worked on his father's farm. And then he thought that he knew better than his father in some respects as to how farming should be done, which was why he left and went to Canada. And so he also provides this little insight into the way that farming was done in Western Canada, which was a really harsh land and harsh climate and distinctly different from what he had experienced in England. And so he writes very beautifully, but practically, kind of pragmatically, but he also captures this window into not only farming practices, but the farming community in both places. Not a lot of literature does that well, which is why this book has had such enduring value. And I read this book because our listeners may have heard me mention a couple of other authors on the podcast before. James Rebanks, who currently is a farmer and author in the United Kingdom, and Wendell Berry, who also is a farmer and author. Both of them have mentioned the value of this book to their own writing. And so I was interested in it, picked it up, read it at the beginning of 2024, and really loved it, unsurprisingly.
You're doing something I do too, which is when I'm reading something I really enjoy, I'm looking to see what's in the footnotes or what was the sources that the author drew from, and then I'm going to find that often in the year to come. So I appreciate that this is a Wendell Berry, James Rebanks influenced selection. You're modeling good reading habits for us.
Thanks. All right, that was it.
Okay.
That was my farming book of the year. Okay, we have one more in this category, and it's one that you listed.
Yeah, I listed The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes by Nancy Pearcey. And we did a whole podcast episode on that, so probably don't need to rehash it here. But I want to put things on the list that I want to just recommend to people. And this is one of those books that I feel like it'd be so good for both men and women to read. And I was telling a mom recently, I said, if you're raising boys, this is a great book to read because of this difference between the real man and the good man. And even for moms of little boys to know, to appeal to the noble, God-given ideal of masculinity that's woven into her son's heart, and yet to not feel like she has to press him into some cultural mold of being a real man, I think is a great distinction. And so I really enjoyed this Nancy Pearcey book. And like Jonathan Haidt, she draws on a lot of data and research, and she kind of backs up what she's saying with some empirical data and evidence. So her argument has a lot of power.
As you mentioned, Hunter, you and I did record a podcast episode in which we discussed this book earlier in the year. So if our listeners are interested in hearing a little bit more about that book or determining whether you might want to pick it up and give it a read yourself, you can look for that episode. Another good way to find out a little bit more about this book, a practice that I like to engage in myself, is look for podcasts in which Nancy Pearcey is interviewed about this book. Some of those are excellent, and they'll give you a sense of the topic that she's covering in this book. It's a good way to just hear a little bit more about it to decide if you want to dedicate the time to reading it. But that, the distinction she makes between the good man and the real man and the way that factors into the book was so helpful and such a good way to understand this conversation and frame up this conversation. So I, too, really appreciated that aspect of this book.
And I found it because of a podcast. I listened to her on, I believe it was the Gospel Bound podcast with Colin Hanson, and listening to her talk about this book made me realize that the book is something different than I thought it was, because I think I told our listeners in our episode, I dismissed it based on the title, or it was uninteresting to me based on the title. The title is a little off-putting to me. And so listening to her talk about it made me go, this is actually really, really interesting. And the book did prove to be that.
Our next category is children's literature. Pretty sure you didn't mention any books
Well, I
in this
didn't,
category.
but I was just thinking I could work in a plug here for my favorite children's book of all time, Policeman Small, by Lois Linsky. Policeman Small is a traffic cop. He tells the cars when to go and stop. That's the first line of the book. It's an illustrated book. Jesse, I think I gave it to Jacob, your son, one time. I love this book. I checked it out of the library when I was a little kid, probably 100 times. I don't know why we didn't buy it, because I wanted to read it every day, but this is kind of how you did books back then. You checked them out of the library, and I guess some people still do that. I just get on Amazon and buy the book. But anyhow, I'm ranting. But Policeman Small is a fantastic children's book. Now, tell us about something that's going to be a little bit more sophisticated.
I don't know if they're more sophisticated, but thank you. Thanks for throwing that in. Policeman Small is a great book, and I love that you have a personal affinity for it and a story about how you loved it so much. That is, like we were mentioning on our last Best Reads of the Year, that's how you know something has enduring literary value, when you keep thinking about it.
And I can still see that one of the things Policeman Small has to deal with during his day is a milk truck has an accident and it spills all its milk, and he gets this little herd of cats to come lick the milk up. And I can still see that picture in my mind's eye of Policeman Small herding those cats.
That illustration. All right. Well, I have two to mention in this category. I picked one 3-volume set of chapter books and then one picture book. So the chapter books are the Wild Robot series by Peter Brown. There's a movie that was just released, I think, a month or so ago that is based on this series called The Wild Robot. I have not seen the movie. My kids have seen the movie and they said it is amazing and very sweet. But the books also, I have read the books and read the first one as a read aloud to my younger two kids, and we loved it. So this series is fun and touching, and just it's a good read for kids on their own from about ages, depends on your reader, but from about ages 7 to 11 or 12, or great read aloud for your family if you have kids of kind of all ages, from younger elementary into middle school. It's called The Wild Robot because the central character is a robot named Roz. And when she comes to life at the beginning of book 1, she finds herself on a wild, remote island. And she doesn't know how she got there or what her purpose is, but she begins to explore the island and figure out how to survive. And then the picture book that I wanted to mention is called A World of Wonder. It's by author Laura Whiffler, and it's illustrated by Jana Mattia. And it's about a little girl named Cora who dreams of designing fantastic things and amazing structures. And she wants to create something that will be like one of the wonders of the world. And
sounds
then,
like the Tower of Babel, Cora's Tower of Babel. We could call this.
Sort of, yes. She sees this as what will define her as accomplishing something.
Yes, she'll reach to the heavens.
And then she returns to her hometown and wants to transform this house at the top of the hill into one of these wonders of the world. And in the process, she learns that living a meaningful life isn't about what she had previously thought. And so it's a sweet book. There's so many wonderful kids' picture books. This is one I enjoyed this year.
And I like what you're modeling for us here, which is reading with kids is one of the best ways to develop a love of reading. And so I can just think of the people who read to me and read with me when I was a kid and be thankful for them. So I love these books.
Okay, let's move into this category, fiction and literature. And you have one to mention in this category, Hunter. It sounds like between The Last Lion and then what was the other very, very voluminous
In Search
book?
of Lost Time by Marcel Proust.
Between those, the other things that you read this year, you said you didn't have as much time to dedicate to this category. But you have one of your best reads.
No, I didn't have as much time for fiction and literature. I was just talking to someone about that this week. I really enjoy reading fiction and trying to read a few quality fiction pieces every year. But this year, I only read one, and that is the novel Père Goriot. That's P-E-R-E, Père, like father, Goriot, by Henri de Balzac.
Continuing in your French era?
My French lit era. This is 19th century French literature. Balzac preceded Proust. I believe their lives overlap just slightly, but Proust was heavily influenced by reading Balzac. He was one of the great novelists who influenced Proust, and I could see the influence on Proust's writing. In particular, Proust designed In Search of Lost Time around these grand social events, like where all the characters would come together at like this ball. And sometimes he would, write 100 pages about all their interactions at this grand social event, and the drama would kind of unfold as a result of this. And Balzac uses that device in Perigorio. So I was like, oh, I recognize where Proust maybe got that idea from. But Balzac's writing is easier to follow than Proust. It's a simpler kind of writing. It was written in the realist tradition, which means he's writing about real events or fictional real events of gritty lives of kind of poor, struggling Parisians. Proust writing is a little bit more impressionistic, and it kind of follows the rise of the impressionistic painting era, where he's much more focused on the perception of events by characters. And so sometimes like what actually happened is a little fuzzy when you read Proust, whereas with Balzac, it's very, very clear, as the realist tradition would hold. And this is just kind of a fun read. It combines a little bit of social intrigue with mystery. There's a mystery and a whodunit element to this as well. There's detectives that show up, and they're looking for the criminal. So there's a little bit of that going on in this as well. And it's not a terribly long book. So this was like a fun novel to read, and I could see the influence on one of my favorite writers.
After we recorded our best reads of 2023, you mentioned, and I also noted, that I don't think I had any fiction literature on my list last year, and I don't gravitate towards fiction. My reading sometimes is determined by what we are reading here. So some books we read for staff learning purposes. Our whole staff reads through a book together, and then we get together periodically and discuss it intentionally. Sometimes you and I select a book to read for the podcast, or because we were interviewing authors this last year, I read those books. So a lot of my reading is determined by those things, or a class that Dave and I lead together. I read for that class, for staff learning, for the podcast. And so it doesn't leave a lot of space always just for reading fiction or reading other books that I would personally probably gravitate to. But one of our listeners, after our best reads of 2023, sent me a short list of novels from 2023 that she really enjoyed, her favorites from 2023, which I loved. I love getting those sorts of emails. And so I checked them out and picked a few off of that list to read. And so one of mine in this category, which is called Go as a River, is a novel. It is set in Iola, Colorado in the 1940s, and it tells the story of a 17-year-old girl who has a chance encounter with a drifter going through the little town looking for lodging and work. His name is Wilson Moon. It's not apparent in the initial description that he is Native American, but as the story unfolds, it becomes obvious that he's Native American, and the people are suspicious immediately of his arrival in town. And so as the story goes along, the main character has a series of things that happen in her life and ultimately finds herself alone without any family, running her family's farm and peach orchard. And she finds out that there's a plan this actually happened to a number of towns in the 40s and 50s, that there's a plan to create a dam that will flood the town. And so she has to decide what she's going to do with her family's peach orchard, which is what remains of her family and is her livelihood. And the trees have this kind of storied reputation. The peaches that her family's farm produced have this storied reputation. And so ultimately, she decides to work with a professor who helps her relocate the majority of her trees. And she is able to keep the family's peach orchard running in a different area of western Colorado. This book was one of the ones that initially I enjoyed it, but I wasn't sure that it would make the best reads of the year for me. But the story stuck with me so much throughout the year, and I really loved that it was set in Colorado. I'm a native Coloradan, and I loved reading the author's kind of description of that area of Colorado and found it to be really true to what I know of the Western Slope and to what I know, here it is, here you go, Hunter, of the agricultural landscape.
I knew it was coming.
In Western Colorado. And so I think the writing was beautiful. It was a slower paced novel. And the author's description at times of some of the people her literary style didn't immediately resonate with me, but the impact of the overall story, I think, did. And so as I was looking through my list of what I read this year, I thought, yeah, actually, this was one of the books that I keep kind of turning over in my mind and thinking about. So I listed it as one of my best reads of the year.
Well, having visited that part of Colorado a few times, it fascinates me. So this book sounds really interesting to me, just from the standpoint of learning a little bit more about our state. Okay, you put another one on here that I'm curious to hear you talk about. It's called The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, and this is a novel?
It is.
Okay.
It is a novel. Yeah. James McBride, the author, has some nonfiction work that he's written too. But this is one of the novels that he has written. And James McBride is a former staff writer for the Washington Post and People Magazine and the Boston Globe. So he was a journalist and then really started his writing career in the sense of he started writing more books. And I think now he primarily writes books. So the Heaven and Earth Grocery Store just kept popping up in all of my suggestions. So based on my other reading, I kept seeing on Audible because of the things that I check out from the library, because of things I've looked up online. Just the algorithms kept sending this my way.
They found you.
And so I read a few reviews and the description and decided to read it. It seems people are pretty divided over this novel, actually. Some people find that there are too many characters, too many subplots, but I found it fascinating and I loved his writing style. So this was an easy one to list on the best reads of the year for me. It's set in Pottstown, Pennsylvania in the 60s and early 70s, and it starts with a mystery. It says in 1972, workers who were digging the foundations for a new housing development uncover a human skeleton. And then it's not resolved for us. That skeleton is barely mentioned until the very end of the book again. So he opens with this mystery and then all that unfolds in the 60s till 1972 to bring us to the point when this skeleton was unearthed and how the skeleton got there. He describes this neighborhood in Pottstown, just at the edge of town, called Chicken Hill. Chicken Hill was where the city's Black residents lived and Jewish immigrants and other Eastern European immigrants. And then the other portion of the town, the kind of main portion of the town, were where the city's white residents lived. And so he describes Chicken Hill mostly in very vivid terms from the perspective of the people who live there. They had very full lives, and he does examine this from the perspective of many of the different inhabitants of Chicken Hill. And so he describes this Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, which was kind of an anchor of the community where Moshe and Shona Ludlow, who were Jews, lived and ran this grocery store. And Shona is one of the main characters, and she has this unending love for all of the residents of Chicken Hill and is always willing to help everyone at whatever expense to herself and Moshe. And Moshe and Shona have a very real, kind of tangible, incredible love that is, because of the way it's described, it doesn't have this ethereal quality. It takes shape in the real way that they interacted with each other and with the other residents of the hill. And so it definitely is an examination of this period in American history and of the effects kind of the civil rights movement, the way that the residents of Chicken Hill viewed the white residents of Pottstown and vice versa, the people who had the ability to kind of travel back and forth between both worlds, and the people who mostly stuck to one side or the other, either the city itself of Pottstown or to the little world of Chicken Hill. So I found it a fascinating examination of life in that place in a period that was also experiencing rapid industrialization and experienced this kind of segregation, and we're in real time sort of sorting out what that would look like and how their lives would take shape. So I loved it. I loved this book. I will say, I want to give a heads up, a disclaimer, and a small spoiler. But in one portion of this book, it is not at all the main portion of the story. It does describe sexual assault. And so if you are sensitive to that, like I am, I don't typically pick books. I kind of screen them beforehand to see if there's something like that in the contents of the book. So if you're listening to it or reading it, you could skip that section. The spoiler is that justice is brought, but not in a way that you would anticipate. So I think it factors into the story. It is not a focal point of the story, but it is necessary to the way that it all resolves. So that's the one disclaimer that I would give.
Well, your description has me hooked, and I've got this on my list now for next year. And this book won all kinds of awards, including the National Book Award. So you're not reading rubbish here. This sounds fantastic, and this might be in one of my family members' stockings this year too.
That also has been a theme. Sometimes, maybe, well, for sure last year.
Yeah.
Hunter picked one of my best reads.
I
as
did.
a gift.
As a gift, and it went over incredibly well. A Year in Provence went over incredibly well with my mom. I also gave a copy to our friend Jen Oshman, who was on the podcast this year. She and her husband were at my house for a Christmas dinner, and we were talking about this book, and I was like, hey, I've got an extra copy. Let me just give you one. And she told me just last week, I love that book. So it's gone viral.
I love it too. I still love it.
Okay, and this brings us to the last book of the year, and we're going to end the year with a book that sounds like a farm book, but it's not, and it's called My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. Autumn, tell us what this is about and why it's not about farming.
It is the story of a family who moves from England to the little Greek island of Corfu, and the author, who's Gerald Durrell, he goes by Jerry Durrell, describes it from his perspective as a 10-year-old. That's how old he was when his family moved. And his mom was a widow, and he has 3 other siblings who are all older than him. He's the youngest by a bit in this family. And the way that he chronicles the journey for his family and life on the island of Corfu is humorous and endearing. And this was a book that, similarly to A Year in Provence, it doesn't rank quite as high as A Year in Provence for me, but it evoked a similar sentiment for me. It had a great dose of realism and relayed the sort of difficulties that they had adapting to the culture with both a honest description, and it was always laced with humor, like a very endearing sort of humor that I loved it. It's called My Family and Other Animals because young Jerry has a tendency everywhere he goes to observe the animal life in the area. And he finds that when he moves from England to Corfu, there are so many animals. There's this world of insect life and animal life that he just loves with his whole self. And so he talks about sitting in the garden, observing all of the little inhabitants of the garden. And then he begins to venture further into the island, and he meets more people. He meets, as he says, some of the peasant folk who live on the island, and he describes his interactions with the various people and characters who he meets, and he ends up with this entire menagerie of pets. And his mother is very long-suffering, and his family is very eccentric, and he describes many of the mishaps that befall them because of his collection of pets, which he never apologizes for or recants. He always really defends his menagerie of animals at the expense of the humans. But it's a delightful, easy, endearing read. It would be like a great vacation read.
I'm connecting to this description of yours because I was always scheming to get some kind of pet when I was a kid. And so I had a goldfish, I had a lizard, I had a cat that adopted me. You know, I had all kinds of pets for brief periods of time, except the cat. She lasted a while. And I was always scheming to get some other animal into the house. So I like the sound of this one.
Yep. This book is the first of a trilogy called the Corfu Trilogy. I haven't yet read the others, so maybe I will this year. But
this is your In Search of Lost Time. This is your Winston Churchill biography.
You know,
the Corfu Trilogy.
Yeah, I don't think it's equivalent. But. And it doesn't have probably the same historical value, but it was just really enjoyable, really fun. And I love this writing style. And I do gravitate always towards books. I think that capture life through someone's eyes in this way, in a way that is unapologetic about the realities of life in that place, but also always handles it with a sort of grace and humor in spite of or in addition to whatever difficulties they might face. I really love accounts that capture that. And I think this does. Jerry Durrell's My Family and Other Animals does that really well. All right, this brings us to the end of our best reads of 2024.
That is our year in reading, and we would love to hear from listeners about what they read this year and what was good. It turns out you actually read a lot of what they recommend. I get people's recommendations, and I love getting them, and I also read kind of slow, so I'm like, no promises that I'll actually read that, but I love ideas, so give me ideas, and I buy more books than I actually read, so...
Thank you for listening to the Vision for Life podcast. As Hunter just mentioned, we love hearing from you. So we would love to know what you're reading. We love receiving your reading suggestions. And we love hearing your comments and ideas about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future. So if you want to get hold of us to send any of those things, you can send it to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.